Hello and welcome to Module 1, University Structure and Employees. In this module, we have input from various texts, which are a blend of theoretical and practical, intentionally so, input from higher education professionals, input from other readings, research, articles that you are reading for various assignments, interviews, and my hope is for integration, so that we can practice a mutually reinforcing loop of theory, reinforcing our praxis, and praxis refining and helping us better articulate our theory. For a foundation, 3 texts. With Palmer and Zejean, we will continue our self-reflection and leadership formation emphasis. The Powers and Schloss chapters are directly related to institutional structures and employees and departments within that structure. And particularly for these chapters, feel free to skim the material about which you're already knowledgeable or familiar, but also HR and accreditation chapters. And finally, the Bowman and Gallos book is an excellent source on academic administration with a pragmatic approach on actual university management. Also, articles. Specific to academic freedom, which obviously is a high priority to faculty, but very much impacts the operations of a university, accreditation, and university systems. I would encourage you to note the authors of all texts or articles and consider their role, their institution. This will help you frame the source and better understand the perspective or purpose for which the content was written. You will view, you're already viewing this Module 1 overview, and you will also watch a PowerPoint created by our Chief HR Officer here at Bethel, Kara Wald. You will respond. This week, the only required assignment is the module discussion board, and the prompts are stated in the syllabus and in the Module 1 discussion board link. But if you choose to do a journal as one of your optional assignments, then your first journal entry will also be due this week. Again, the prompts are in the syllabus and the journal link, and any other of the optional assignments could be submitted as well. Finally, plan. I'm asking you to plan ahead in this course. As early in this module as you can, please select a topic and begin research for your literature review. An initial draft will be due at the end of the second module, the end of your 4th week. Also, you may want to consider completing an article review, watching the online enabler video and writing that paper, or setting up future interviews with administrators. Administrator schedules can be particularly full, so those may necessitate significant pre-planning. Before we begin to consider university structures and systems, a review of the post-secondary institutional landscape is helpful. First, this pie chart provides a visual for some of the Schloss and Krag data from Chapter 1. However, an important reminder is that although private nonprofits are the most numerous of all 4 options presented here, and public 4 years are the fewest, this is only the number of institutions in America. This is not proportionate to the number of students enrolled. In fact, it is the opposite. Public institutions enroll the most students, and the private for-profit enrolled almost half as many as private nonprofit, despite the discrepancy in the number of institutions. Also, because of the publishing date of this text and the challenging higher education landscape over the past couple years in particular, there has been a significant decline or closure in the number of private for-profit institutions, which would change these numbers a bit. This context is important for us, as it is easy for the university setting in which we are in or with which we are familiar, say alumni services or development, to become our default and really shape our perspectives on higher education topics. We don't want to have a narrow viewpoint that would result in inadvertently ineffective decisions. In this module, we will consider institutional employees and human resources. And HR is incredibly important, which is why I chose to put this topic first, because it is how and the way we form our more permanent community. Students matriculate through, in 2, 4, 6 years, depending on the degree, hopefully, a certain period of time. But those of us who are a part of the staff, administration, and faculty are part of a more permanent community, culture, organization. Our students really do become who we are. So we can teach and deliver content, but the reality is that in all things, our actions, even if they're organizational actions, speak louder than our words. So the people who we choose to put on our staff and faculty are important, as they become the role models for our students. If we want our students to think and act in certain ways, then we need to be very careful about what type of role models we provide for students. So Kara Wald, in her presentation available on your course Moodle site, will talk about HR primarily from the staff and administration perspective. Her role has changed slightly, even in the last month, since she created this video, but here she covers legal compliance, care for employees, organizational culture, etc. It is important to note that faculty hiring is very different. Faculty hiring is done by committee and through the office of the provost. Speaking from my experience as an assistant provost, faculty hiring is one of the most significant factors in impacting student retention and ultimately institutional success. This is about choosing the people who are going to be in the classroom with our students. As an academic administrator, I spent a lot of time talking with faculty about the integration of faith and learning, arguably one of the most critical components of a faith-based college or university. That is a distinctive. We want faculty to be able to articulate the ways that their Christian commitment impacts the learning in their field. Another important area, at least to me, was the hiring of diverse faculty. Unfortunately, this is an area that higher education institutions across the country struggle with, both public and private. Oftentimes, the faculty demographics do not reflect the student demographics in terms of race and ethnicity. A few learnings that I would emphasize in regard to hiring faculty. In searching for faculty, it is very important to pay attention to our search criteria when we are recruiting faculty candidates. It's easy for us to think about things in the way that we understand them, and it's easy for us to say that we want a candidate who is completely outside of our box, who brings new and fresh ideas, but the reality is that the way that we shape our positions, we often shape them to resemble a certain kind of person. One of the ways that I discovered that we do that is by using insider language. At Bethel, those might be terms like irenic spirit or pietism. And you might not even know to what I'm referring, but that is precisely the point. Because internally at Bethel, we understand those terms. Most of us speak that language. We're looking for a certain type of person. But when you unpack that, the only people who are going to understand what that means are people who grew up in the tradition or are familiar with the tradition, who look and think and act like us. So be cautious about insider language that sends a message that if you do not speak this language, you do not belong. And that has been very challenging for our search committees to think critically about the way that we are recruiting candidates and how we are inviting people to join us if we really do want diverse perspectives. When we invite people with diverse perspectives, then we need to be trustworthy in that process. Spend some time in the Chronicle and you will see numerous examples of situations in which people were hired, often because of their diverse perspectives, because that diverse perspective was desired, only to find that their perspective was actually maybe too diverse. This is a common situation in theology departments that often demand that faculty uphold very specific denominational doctrines. So how do we demonstrate trustworthy practices in the hiring process? And after the hiring, how do we continue to support these faculty and staff? And finally, be committed. We need to create an atmosphere embracing of diversity, encouraging of multiple points of view, and this helps all of us to develop more cognitive dissonance and cultural competence. Faculty hiring is important, and hiring of diverse faculty is critically important, but it remains a challenge. In thinking about institutional systems, I am shaped by the work of Hale. In What Makes Racial Diversity Work in Higher Education, Hale states, "We can learn to notice the culture of power around us." This is really important for us to pay attention to. What symbols do we use? For example, if you look at our catalog, are we accurately reflecting the way that we look as a community? The types of initiatives we commit to, or budget breakdowns? I guess I'm speaking both institutionally and personally here. In terms of our image and how we present ourselves, both that we are accurately reflecting us and to be aspirational to some degree, so people know where our values are. Also, pay attention to who we are including or not when we make decisions. I've noticed at Bethel we are very inclusive in making our education accessible. However, it is not very often that disability services are brought to the table in program creation and decisions. If you asked anybody, of course they would say that we cared about making education accessible, but in order to do that, we have to have the right people at the table. Another quote, "Those inside the culture of power rarely notice it, while those excluded are often acutely sensitive to how they and others are being marginalized." This reminds me of the classic story of the two young fish who are swimming downstream and pass an older fish swimming upstream. The older fish says, "How's the water?" And the younger fish look at each other and say, "What water?" So those of us who are embedded in positions of power, whether through social location or position authority, often are unaware of the reality of life for those who are not part of the power structure. So another good reflection prompt is, how will you acknowledge and manage your power as a leader? I've provided some different resources so that you can familiarize yourself with the accreditation process. But I also want you to spend some time familiarizing yourself with the actual accreditation guidelines, because what I have found is that people think of accreditation in ways that are entirely different than the reality of accreditation. People often believe accreditation guidelines are very specific, and in reality they are not. The standards are often very broad, reflective of the idea that strong institutions are institutions that follow these types of practices, and then accreditors determine how an institution fulfills those types of practices. But accreditors really allow institutions to shape their response to those values in various ways. So I think you will be surprised if you haven't looked at actual accreditation guidelines before about what they actually do and do not dictate. It is very much a general set of guidelines and a common sense approach as to what makes a quality institution. I have worked with accreditation, both regional and secondary or professional accreditations, and all have allowed great latitude to the ways that we applied the principles to what we did. So to be honest, from my experience, I am not afraid of accreditation and government regulation, and in fact found it to be a good thing, a constructive process. I believe in accountability. I believe that as higher education professionals, we should hold ourselves and one another to good, if not exceptional, behavior. And unfortunately, it is not always the case that we self-regulate to the degree that we do not need that accountability. And even if we wanted to self-regulate to that degree, and an institution doesn't always have the knowledge and exposure to know how to do that or what those expectations should be. So I'm actually one who supports some version of the process. Could it be improved or updated? Absolutely. Is it always a joy or fun? Maybe not. But there is definitely a place for them when federal resources are involved. Some prompts to consider, or even ask administrators if you do administrator interviews, what are the strengths and challenges of accreditation and accountability processes? Kara talked in her presentation a bit about her compliance with legal requirements, and that is challenging. But I also know Kara is one who would say that regulations exist to protect us and make us better. Further reflection, why do some educational leaders bristle at regulation? And how can we, as educational leaders, respond in positive and productive ways to these guidelines that are likely not going away? So we asked, how will we acknowledge and manage our power as a leader? One approach comes from Palmer and Zajonc, and I will conclude with this, as a sort of blessing for the beginning of this course. Think the world together instead of thinking it apart. Throughout our education process, especially our college education, we do a lot of deconstruction. absolutely important, especially because the more you do it, the more you realize that many of our constructs are based on assumptions, not all of which are correct. But in this doctoral program, we really want you to focus on integration and synthesis, integration of self, content, leadership practices. This prompt is a great way of envisioning the kind of education that we want to have happen. Never stop questioning your assumptions, but always remember to bring your deconstruction back to a constructive way of thinking and being in the world. Practice this in your community, in your classes. As we have said before, this is a safe space, your leadership lab, so open yourself up to refinement, solicit feedback, and be consciously and actively learning from this community of knowers. I'm sorry this ended up being a long PowerPoint. I hope that gives you some additional ideas and content to consider for this module. And I hope you enjoy the reading and your interactions with each other. I'm looking forward to your responses. Please contact me with any questions.